This is the case of Henry Caldwell, a hard-working machinist from Ontario, his mysterious wife Evelyn, and her long-lost husband Thomas Harrington, a tangled web of secrets that ended in one of the most shocking triple murders Canada had ever seen. Before we begin, make sure to support the channel by subscribing and staying active so you never miss the darkest and most twisted true crime stories we uncover here. Your support helps us bring these forgotten cases back to life. What started as a picture-perfect marriage quickly unraveled into betrayal, obsession, and bloodshed. Henry thought he had found love, but hidden in Evelyn's past was a secret that would pull another man, Thomas, into their lives and lead to a night of unimaginable violence. In 1937, a quiet mining town in northern Ontario was buzzing with whispers about a new couple. Henry Caldwell, a 32-year-old machinist, had always been the kind of man people trusted. He worked long shifts at the mill, came home on time, and never gave anyone reason to doubt his character. When he returned from Toronto with a new wife, the town greeted the news with excitement. The woman's name was Evelyn, and she seemed like she had stepped out of a magazine. Her dark hair, porcelain skin, and elegant way of carrying herself made her stand out immediately among the town's modest, hard-working families. To Henry, she was everything he had ever wanted, a chance at love after years of solitude, and proof that his quiet, disciplined life could finally bloom into something meaningful. Neighbors were eager to meet her, but they quickly noticed how little Evelyn shared about her past. When asked about her family, she would smile politely and change the subject. If pressed about where she grew up, she would laugh and say it was a long way from here, without offering details. Henry brushed off these quirks, explaining that Evelyn was simply private, and many accepted that explanation. After all, she was polite enough, attending church on Sundays and keeping the Caldwell home neat and beautiful. Henry was proud to walk beside her through town, proud to introduce her as his wife. Still, there was something about Evelyn that never seemed to fit. The townsfolk whispered about the way she avoided eye contact when asked personal questions, or how she sometimes received letters she refused to open in front of anyone. To Henry, love mattered more than curiosity, and he believed her silence was harmless. For a while, it truly looked like their marriage was built to last. After only a few months of marriage, the flawless image Henry had built in his mind began to fade. At first, the changes were subtle. Evelyn, once eager to join him for evening walks through town, began to withdraw. She would excuse herself for errands that lasted far longer than necessary. When she returned, her explanations felt vague, sometimes contradictory, as though she had rehearsed them but forgotten the script midway. Henry noticed her clutching letters tightly before slipping them into drawers, always locking them away where he could not see. The secrecy gnawed at him, though he tried to convince himself that every marriage had mysteries in the beginning. Friends and co-workers teased him about how little anyone really knew about Evelyn. Too secretive, some joked, though their tone hinted at unease. Henry would laugh along, but privately, the comments dug into him. The woman he had promised to spend his life with seemed to live in a shadow he could not reach. Simple matters turned strange. She refused to register her maiden name at the parish, claiming it was unnecessary. When forms required her place of birth, she would delay, offering excuses until Henry grew tired of asking. If he pressed too hard, she snapped, her calm exterior cracking into cold defensiveness. The more Henry tried to brush off his doubts, the heavier they became. He started to feel like his home was no longer his own, that a stranger had moved in under the guise of being his wife. Every smile of hers felt like a mask, every affectionate gesture rehearsed. Evelyn's silences, once charming, now unsettled him. The marriage that had begun with so much promise was slipping into unease, and Henry was beginning to sense that the truth was far darker than he dared imagine. One afternoon, while Evelyn was away on one of her unexplained outings, Henry found himself pacing the small kitchen, his thoughts restless. The unease had been building for weeks, and when he noticed a fresh letter lying on the table with her name scrawled across the envelope, temptation overcame him. He hesitated at first, knowing it was a breach of trust, but something inside told him the answer to his doubts was sealed inside. With trembling hands, he tore it open. What he read pulled the ground out from beneath him. The letter was written in hurried, emotional words, but its meaning was crystal clear. The man who wrote it called Evelyn his wife, begging her to come back home, insisting that she belonged with him, not with another. The more Henry read, the more his chest tightened. At the bottom of the page, a photograph had been tucked into the fold. In it, Evelyn stood beside a man he had never seen before, her expression familiar but softer, more intimate than any look she had ever given him. The pieces began to fit together in his mind, and the revelation struck like a hammer blow. He had not married a widow, nor a woman with an innocent past. He had married someone already bound to another. Shock quickly gave way to fury. He felt humiliated, deceived, reduced to a pawn in a cruel game. The pride he had carried through town, showing off his beautiful bride, now seemed like a sick joke at his expense. Every strange silence, every evasive answer, every locked drawer had been a warning he had ignored. Alone in his kitchen, clutching the letter and photo, Henry realized the life he thought he was building was nothing but a carefully crafted illusion. Henry's discovery left him restless, unable to eat or sleep. Each night, as Evelyn drifted into a peaceful slumber beside him, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind circling the same questions. Who was the man in the photograph? How long had she been planning this deception? What else was she hiding? The letter was no longer enough. He needed answers. He began searching for scraps of truth wherever he could find them. When Evelyn left the house, he rummaged through drawers and trunks, uncovering small items that didn't fit her story. Papers with unfamiliar names, a wedding band tucked away in a velvet pouch, and receipts from towns she had never mentioned visiting. His search eventually led him to public records and parish registers, where the truth began to take shape. The name Thomas Harrington appeared, tied to Evelyn's maiden name in a marriage record from Nova Scotia 5 years earlier. The date was undeniable, falling long before she had ever crossed paths with him. Henry read and reread the record, his blood boiling. The woman he loved had already been bound to another, and she had erased that life without explanation, sliding seamlessly into his. Confronting Evelyn directly only deepened the mystery. When he asked about her family, her voice grew sharp, her face pale with sudden anger. If he pressed, she would walk away, retreating into silence. At times she seemed almost cold, as if daring him to uncover what she refused to say. Henry began to see her differently, not as the charming bride who had dazzled him months before, but as a stranger occupying his home, a person with two faces. Every glance, every word, every moment together now carried the heavy weight of betrayal. The more Henry learned, the more he felt trapped in a life that wasn't his own. Days at the mill became unbearable, his thoughts consumed by betrayal. His friends noticed how withdrawn he had grown, but he offered no explanation. At home, Evelyn carried on with a cold detachment, as though daring him to speak aloud what he now knew. For Henry, silence was no longer enough. He needed to face the ghost of Evelyn's past, the man she had abandoned yet never truly severed ties with. The decision weighed on him heavily, but at last he resolved to act. He would travel east, to Nova Scotia, and confront the man who had unknowingly shared his wife. The journey was long and grueling, taking him through small towns and endless stretches of rugged countryside. Each passing mile hardened his resolve. He imagined what he might find at the end, an angry rival, a grieving widower, or perhaps someone just as deceived as he was. When Henry finally arrived at the quiet coastal town where Thomas Harrington lived, the scene was far removed from the turmoil in his own heart. Fishing boats lined the docks, children played along the street, and life seemed simple, untouched by betrayal. Meeting Thomas shattered Henry's expectations. The man was older than he had pictured, with a weary face marked by years of loss. Thomas spoke of Evelyn with sorrow, describing how she had vanished without a trace during a summer trip, leaving him to mourn her as though she were dead. He had lived in grief, convinced she had been taken by the sea. Listening to him, Henry felt both rage and a strange kinship. They had been victims of the same lie, bound together by a woman who had abandoned them both. When Henry returned to Ontario with Thomas at his side, the air seemed charged with a tension that could not be hidden. The neighbors watched with curiosity as the two men entered the Caldwell home together, but none could have imagined the storm building behind those doors. Evelyn, seeing Thomas alive and standing beside her current husband, froze as though the ground had given way beneath her. Her carefully constructed life, balanced on secrecy and silence, had collapsed in an instant. The look on her face told Henry everything. There was no denial, no attempt to disguise what had been revealed. The hours that followed were filled with an intensity that could never be fully reconstructed. Those living nearby later spoke of muffled sounds, raised voices, hurried footsteps, and then long stretches of silence that made the air feel heavy. Inside, Evelyn faced the past she had tried to bury and the two men who now demanded an explanation. She tried to justify her choices, painting herself as a victim of circumstance, but neither Henry nor Thomas could see beyond the lies. For Henry, it was a brutal confirmation that the woman he had cherished had deceived him at every turn. For Thomas, it was the resurrection of grief, twisted into betrayal. What exactly was said, and how the tension escalated, would never be fully known. But the confrontation stripped away every layer of Evelyn's disguise. No longer could she hide behind vague answers or charming smiles. Every secret, every silence, had finally demanded a price. As the night stretched on, the walls of the Caldwell home became a cage of rage, humiliation, and heartbreak. The fragile threads holding the three together were fraying fast, and it was only a matter of time before they snapped with catastrophic force. By dawn, the mining town stirred to a quiet morning, unaware of the horror that had unfolded only hours before. A thin curl of smoke rose steadily from the Caldwell chimney, giving the impression of routine life inside. But when a neighbor noticed the house unusually still, with no movement at the windows and no sight of Henry heading to work, concern began to creep in. Curiosity turned to unease, and by late morning, a close friend of Henry's decided to check on him. Pushing the door open, he stepped into silence broken only by the faint hiss of the fire. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the parlor, Evelyn lay sprawled across the carpet, lifeless, her once beautiful face frozen in shock. In the kitchen, Thomas was discovered collapsed near the table, a dark pool spreading beneath him. Upstairs, Henry's body was found on the bed, a pistol resting nearby, the final act written in grim certainty. It was a scene of devastating violence, one that would carve its place into the town's memory forever. Investigators pieced together the events as best they could. The conclusion was grim yet clear. Henry, consumed by betrayal and humiliation, had turned on the two people who represented his deepest wounds. Evelyn's lies had destroyed the foundation of his life, and Thomas's presence had forced him to face the full weight of her deception. After killing them both, he had turned the weapon on himself. The Caldwell home became the focus of hushed conversations and fearful glances. Townsfolk walked past it quickly, unwilling to linger near the place where 3 lives had ended so brutally. The tragedy felt almost unreal, as if an unspoken curse had been unleashed within those walls. The Caldwell murders quickly grew into legend, their details whispered from porch to porch and passed down through generations. In a small town where gossip often faded as quickly as it spread, this story clung stubbornly, refusing to be forgotten. The abandoned home where it all happened stood empty for years, its windows boarded, its frame weathered by harsh northern winters. Some said they heard faint footsteps inside long after it was deserted, while others swore the air around the property always felt colder than the rest of the street. Children dared each other to approach the rotting front steps, but few were brave enough to linger. Theories swirled endlessly about Evelyn's motives. Some believed she had been a master manipulator, moving from one life to another, using men as stepping stones and discarding them when convenient. Others argued she had been desperate, trapped in a life she no longer wanted, and had tried to escape in the only way she knew how. To some, Henry was the true villain, a man whose pride and rage eclipsed reason, turning betrayal into bloodshed. And there were those who pitted Thomas most of all, a man who had lived years believing he was a widower, only to discover that his grief had been based on a lie. The case became more than a crime. It became a cautionary tale. Parents warned their children about the dangers of secrecy and deceit, using the Caldwell name as a chilling example. Over time, the house was torn down, its remains cleared away to make room for new growth. Yet even without the building, the story lingered. People said lies never stay buried, that hidden lives always find their way to the surface. In the town's history, the Caldwell tragedy became a permanent scar, a reminder that deception can destroy far more than trust. It can consume lives.